The Australian Financial Review.
It's very early here in Kyiv, so it's just after 6:30. I'm standing in the middle of Taras Shevchenko Park, which is right next to the university in the centre of Kyiv.
That's Misha Zelinsky, a union official and Fulbright scholar.
So my family is Russian-Ukrainian, so I grew up speaking Russian. Not Ukrainian, but that's probably kind of not dissimilar to a lot of people in that era.
He first went to Ukraine 8 months ago when Russia invaded and has been based there on and off, covering the war for the Australian Financial Review.
This park itself was subject to attack. Kyiv was hit by a number of strikes, and 2 of them were just right near where I'm standing.
Misha and I spoke just days after more than 80 Russian rockets pummeled a dozen Ukrainian cities, including the capital Kyiv, where he was staying.
The strikes were obviously intended to cause maximum terror. These weren't military installations, as I've just described. This is a cultural and recreation capital. The park that was hit, I'd been in it less than 24 hours before the strike, and it had been full of families and kids, buskers playing. The sun was out. It was late autumn sun, beautiful day in Kyiv. And the hole in the park now has also been filled in. The hole in the road has been filled in and cars are driving on it. So I can see them driving over the spot with the fresh tar. The damage has actually been repaired quite quickly. So the Ukrainians are showing incredible resilience. But of course, the damage is happening faster than you can repair it, regrettably. But nevertheless, certainly the intent, as I understand it, is to show as much defiance and ability to go on with life. And that's absolutely happening, irrespective of the damage. The spirit is unbroken.
From the Australian Financial Review, I'm Lisa Murray. This is The Fin. Today, a conversation with Misha Zelinsky in 2 parts. On the ground in Kyiv, and then back in Australia earlier this week. He tells us what life is like in the war-torn country and how, amid a barrage of attacks on its electricity infrastructure, Ukraine is preparing for its biggest test yet. Winter. It's Thursday, October 27.
Life and war go on in parallel. Things are as normal as possibly can be where it's safe for it to be so. So in Ukraine, depending on the city and depending on its distance to the front, life can be relatively normal. In Kyiv, last week has changed things with these several attacks that we've seen, but overall, people are shopping, going to restaurants, going to work, hanging out, seeing friends and family. The streets are quite busy unless there is a siren, which of course then people go inside or go underground into a metro station as a makeshift bomb shelter. But broadly speaking, it's quite normal. The closer you get to the front line, or closer you get to what they call the zero line, you'll see fewer lights at night. There'll be blackouts enforced. There'll be curfews enforced. Every city has a curfew, but depending on how safe it is, curfew might be midnight till 6 a.m. If it's a dicier, it might be 10 p.m., 9 p.m. So, if the strategy from Putin is to, break Ukrainian will or to intimidate them into surrender, he's getting the exact opposite effect through these types of attacks that we've seen over the last week and a bit. Whenever there is an attack, there's an outcry of anger and sorrow at the lives lost. But what you then see is a huge upspring of determination and an absolute confidence of victory. If you did a poll that said Zelensky has got 98% support, I'd say that's probably a little low. He's absolutely astronomically popular here. I think he's done an extraordinary job. Even those people who may have been his critics or his rivals prior to the war have all say that he's been absolutely titanic in his leadership. When I talk to Ukrainians, they say, well, no one gave us 24 hours. Then when we made 24 hours and 48 hours and 72 hours and now 230 plus days of the war, there's a sense of growing confidence, and why wouldn't there be? They're winning right now.
This is what a kamikaze drone attack sounds like. What's thought to be an Iranian-built Shahed 136 slams into a building in Kyiv. Russia fired more than 20 of these into Ukraine on Monday.
This is the destruction the drones left behind. One side of an apartment block reduced to rubble. A week after Russia renewed its attacks on the capital, the airstrikes have already become a new normal for some Kyiv residents.
You know, if you close your eyes, again, you might imagine yourself in any European capital. And then suddenly you'll get a siren, a wailing siren. You know, I'd never heard one, I think, until February 23. It's one of the more shocking sounds I'd ever heard. And before long, that becomes a kind of a background noise that you get used to, and you just act accordingly and, you know, calmly do what you need to do in terms of getting to somewhere safe. Now, in terms of the drones, I think they add a dimension of terror that you don't necessarily get from missiles. And as there's a humming, shrieking sound that they have, which again is more disconcerting. They can hover before they attack. And so there's a little bit more of a sadistic quality to them, I think, and people feel more unsettled at the idea that there's a drone with a person looking, and if your light's on, that might be an attractive target. So I think that has created a new level of anxiety. Last Monday when the missiles hit Kyiv, I was actually shaken awake. The explosion was so loud, and it was only a few hundred meters from my hotel, and you could actually feel the vibrations of that missile strike. And so the rumbling of explosions is something that, you know, nothing quite prepares you for that. And then, you know, these sounds you're hearing, kids are hearing explosions every day. I was talking to a volunteer who said to me that there's going to be an absolute epidemic of PTSD here, not just of the soldiers, but of the population. And those sounds never quite leave you. Overall, I feel quite safe. And there's sort of two things that I always say when people ask me that question is, one, I'm not picking up a gun and being asked to fight for my country. And secondly, I can leave. And I am leaving. I am getting in a car to drive to Lviv. I'll cross into Poland later this evening, and I'll fly home out of Warsaw the next day.
As the war in Ukraine escalates, Russia has fired a barrage of missiles into Ukrainian territory. Ukrainian Air Force officials said 33 missiles were fired at the country yesterday. Local authorities claim the strikes were aimed at energy facilities. More than 1 million people across Ukraine were reportedly without power.
An intense new wave of strikes on power supply this morning. Among the targets hit were energy facilities in Odessa in the south and Lutsk to the west. Ukraine says the attacks have already damaged a third of its power network, and rationing power is becoming kind of the new normal here, you know, and especially as the bitter winter approaches.
After the break, we talk to Misha back in Australia. Thanks for coming into the studio to talk to us. Tell us about your exit from Ukraine last week.
Look, it was always a mixed feelings when you leave Ukraine. It's a combination of relief, obviously, because once you cross into Poland, you're much safer, but there's a feeling of sort of guilt and sadness leaving friends behind and seeing the situation obviously continues to worsen.
So when we last spoke, you were calling from a neighbourhood in Kyiv, which just days earlier had been the target of an attack. Since then, there have been more attacks, and Russia's strategy appears to be damage as much critical and energy infrastructure as possible before winter. What do you think Vladimir Putin is hoping to achieve?
Well, it's clear he wants to freeze Ukrainians in their homes, and friends of mine I've been speaking to, not just in Kyiv, but other cities, are increasingly dealing with long power outages. A lot of cities now are completely dark at night, even cities that aren't on the front line. That's typical. As you go to the front line, lights will be out to avoid drone attacks or missile attacks. But now you're seeing it in major cities like Kyiv, which are a long, long way away from the front line, to conserve power. There's some estimates saying 30 or 40% of Ukrainian critical power infrastructure has been damaged, which is a huge amount. And so it's putting an enormous strain on Ukraine's ability to generate power. I saw a report saying that they've got plenty of gas as they head into the heating season, so that will hopefully keep Ukrainians warm. But being warm and in the dark, perhaps, is it's not much better, really. So, the strategy's been clear for some time. There's been bombarding for a number of weeks, but you're now starting to see that strategy pay some kind of dividend for Putin. The amount of damage he's inflicted, and so it's going to be enormously challenging on a logistics basis when you don't have power. But it's a morale thing too, to make people cold and miserable in a long winter. And Eastern Europe is a cold place during the wintertime, minus 20, minus 30 degrees. And you can imagine being dark and cold in those circumstances is not particularly pleasant. But it's important to note that people might go, oh, this is an interesting tactic. It's also a war crime. It's illegal to do this under the Geneva Convention. So Russia's committed a number of war crimes, and it's escalating them again.
What are people saying on the ground about how they're preparing for winter?
So Vitaly Kim is the governor of Mykolaiv in the south, which is a city that's been under constant bombardment from the Russians. He said, look, we want to protect our critical infrastructure. That's our number one. Plan A, he described it. But plan B, he said, is we'll just endure it. His words were, we've had winters for centuries before we had internal heating and internal electricity, and we survived it, and we'll survive this too. So there's a high degree of stoicism. So if we looked at Putin's tactics are to make Ukrainians cold, miserable, it won't break their spirit in terms of their endurance to win the war. And so if that's his strategy, I think it'll be a failing one in the end, notwithstanding its brutality.
So winter will also be an issue for Russia, which has just had to call up reservists to reinforce their troops. How do you think the Russian forces will cope with the cold? And how do you think their mobilisation is going?
Well, they're going to cope very badly. If you look at the fact that their logistics have been absolutely diabolical through the early parts of this war, it's hard to see how they're going to improve with all the difficulties that come from winter. So when you assess which side's going to have more challenges, Ukrainians have got plenty of problems where they've had so many dwellings destroyed. There's a report today that 7.5% of all Ukrainian dwellings have been destroyed or severely damaged. You look at the number of windows that have been blown out around the place and how that impacts on the ability to heat a home. But they've got the home ground advantage. So the Russians are a long way from home. They've got hugely challenging logistical problems. They're going to have nowhere to hide. They're going to be stuck out there in minus 20, minus 30 in the snow with poor equipment. That doesn't make for a happy army when they're already losing. So it was put to me that whichever side freezes first will be the side that loses. And so the Russians have huge challenges, and I can't imagine that they're going to overcome those quite easily either. So the mobilization, it's happened. Putin says that they've called up these close to 300,000 people, but to what degree that they've been properly equipped and properly armed, we will find out, I imagine, over the next couple of months.
So how both sides survive winter will be key to the outcome of this war. But the other big issue is what happens in Kherson, isn't it?
What happens in Kherson will be quite critical, which is the south city. It's a Black Sea port. It's not too far from Mykolaiv. There's a lot of focus on that at the moment. But for some time now, Putin has essentially left a huge army on the western side of the Dnipro River, which is the river that cuts Ukraine in two. They're going to be, or they have been trapped there, being bombarded by Ukrainian artillery. Now, if the Russians make the decision to withdraw out of Kherson and give up that city, it gives a huge boost to the Ukrainians who see that city quite literally as a symbol of hope. It was a city that was watched very closely. It fell in the early couple of days of the war. It's a keystone city that opens up the entire south, cities like Melitopol, Berdyansk, and even up to Mariupol. It also is the keystone to Crimea. So if Putin has to give that up, and that symbol of hope that the Ukrainians, it'll be a huge boost militarily and a huge boost on a morale basis for the Ukrainians.
But if, as recent reports suggest, Russia does try and hold the city, how could that impact the conflict?
Of course, if the reports are true that the Russians are now sending more troops in to reinforce Kherson, that may help them hold the city, though I'd be extremely skeptical because what Putin is fighting against here is reality and geography. His troops are trapped on the wrong side of the river. Any general would tell him dispassionately they should fall back, give up Kherson and regroup on the eastern side of the Dnipro River. But for political reasons, he decides he's got to hold on to that city. He may hold it in the near term leading into winter, but it could cost him a hell of a lot more as we head into the spring next year if he loses all those high-quality troops on the western side of the river. So if I had to predict the thing that would be most impactful on the war, I'd say it's how winter affects both sides, and we've sort of covered that, but also what happens in Kherson ahead of winter. And if the Russians lose that in a disorderly manner, I think that would be a huge problem for them going forward.
What is it going to take to get Volodymyr Zelensky and Vladimir Putin back to the negotiating table?
Well, it's hard to imagine. So if you look at both sides, so let's look at it from the Russian point of view. Putin has just engaged in a diabolically bad war where he's been humiliated on a military basis, on an economic basis, on a strategic basis. His army has been smashed by a supposed military minnow in Ukraine, and he's got nothing out of it. And so he would go back to a position that basically what he had before he started. Look, that seems difficult given the way he's raised the stakes about the fact that Ukraine belongs to Russia. Now, Elon Musk has been using Putin's talking points around, well, if they give up Crimea and they give up this and they never join NATO and they never join the EU, then maybe we can start talking. Well, it doesn't really sound like a really good negotiating point for the Ukrainians. Too many people when they're discussing peace don't consider what the Ukrainians want. It's, well, what does Russia want? What could the West and what can the Europeans live with? What can the Ukrainians live with after everything that they've been through? And I think giving them the best negotiating position when they're ready to negotiate, well, and then I think we should listen closely to what they want.
Thanks so much for talking to us, firstly from Kyiv and back in the studio. What are your plans now? Are you planning to go back to Ukraine?
We've been discussing the winter. -20, -30 is beyond my capability. So my hat goes off to the Ukrainians who are about to suffer through what could be a very cold and miserable winter. I hope I don't have to go back. I hope this is resolved and the war's over. So fingers crossed we get a resolution. But for all the reasons we've discussed, I think it might be challenging.
Thanks, Misha.
Thanks very much, Lisa. Pleasure to be here.
Here's the other big stories we're covering this week. Russia and Ukraine accused each other of planning to use a dirty bomb to spread radioactive material, raising fears that Moscow might use such an attack as a pretext to launch a nuclear weapon. Australia's red-hot inflation rate continues to rise faster than expected, hitting 7.3% a year on Wednesday, locking in a rate rise of at least 0.25% when the Reserve Bank meets next Tuesday. And health insurer Medibank's shares plunged after it admitted the data of 4 million customers had been stolen by criminals, and the number of affected customers could grow substantially. Thank you for listening to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray, with Misha Zelinsky reporting today. The Fin is produced by Alex Gow and Lap Fan. Fiona Buffini is the executive producer. Our theme and original music are by Alex Gow. For more stories about markets, business and power, subscribe to The Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. We'll be back next week.
The Australian Financial Review.